group 2. So you will have all of the information that way too, but just really want to right now, especially when things are changing day by day with the pandemic, it takes our data a long time to catch up to what's going on in the real world. So really appreciate any thoughts and insights that you all have to share. So the pandemic upended many things, many aspects of our lives, and Kids Count was nowhere near the top of that list of important things that it changed, but it did require some changes and a new approach to the 2021 edition of our report, which is what we're here to talk about today. And that's because normally when we put out Kids Count, no matter what's going on, there's always a little bit of a lag in the data because it takes a little while for the organizations that are putting the data together to collect it and clean it and put it out there for the public to use. And so normally our report in 2021 would have had mostly data from 2019. But by the time 2021 rolled around, nobody really cared what was going on in 2019 anymore because we were also focused on what had happened to our state and to our families in 2020. And so we had to think a little bit differently about how could we still provide really timely, accurate, reliable data from reputable sources, but also be able to tell a timely story about what was actually going on for families during the first year of the pandemic, which is what I think the question that was on all of our minds as we were dealing with the COVID crisis. So just wanted to say that we do still include some of those pre-pandemic data from the places where we've always gotten data. So we include child poverty data from the Census Bureau, health insurance data, different data that we get from state agencies. And these data, even though they're a couple years old, can still be really valuable because they tell us where were we doing really well before the pandemic as a state, and where do we want to make sure that we're protecting that progress. And then in what areas were we already struggling or being really vulnerable? And those are the areas where we might need to double down and really make sure that those challenges aren't getting exacerbated by everything that's happened in the last couple of years. So you'll still see some of that data that you've always seen in Kids Count if you're familiar with it. But this year, again, we wanted to make sure that we were providing the information that we knew people really wanted, which is what's going on for kids and families in the, I don't want to say in the aftermath, because 2 years later, we're still living it, but in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in order to do that, we turned to some different sources, a lot of ones that were put together right when the pandemic started to try to collect almost real-time data on what's going on for kids and for families. So these are really great because they are timely. They are able to tell us, you know, a couple of months ago, just what was going on for kids. But the downside is that they're often only available at the state level and not at the county level. So just saying that because as we move through today, you might see some interesting pandemic data and wonder, why aren't we talking about Adams County specifically? And it's usually because it's just only available for Colorado right now. We're hoping with our new report this year, we'll have a lot more county level data to share on the pandemic months and years, but for now, a lot of it's only available at the state level. So just wanted to sort of explain what you'll see as we move through today. With all of that background stuff aside, we can go ahead and dive into some of the data from the 2021 report, and we'll start with family economic security. And we like to start with this because we know that a family's economic circumstances impact every single aspect of their lives. It impacts their access to healthy food, their access to healthcare, their access to early learning opportunities and high quality K-12 learning opportunities. And so I think it's really important as we move through the rest of the presentation and talk about some of those other topics that we have a good understanding of where families stand economically. And so we'll start by looking at sort of that pre-pandemic time period about what was going on for kids and families in our state financially before the pandemic hit. And we had all of the economic aftershocks that came with that. So this is a graph that shows the child poverty rate in the United States. That's the purple line that you see there, as well as for Colorado, that's the green line. And you can see that in the years leading up to the pandemic, we were seeing Colorado's child poverty rate sort of steadily declining year after year after year, down from 18%, almost 1 in 5 kids right after the Great Recession ended, dropping steadily down to 11% of all kids across the state. While that was a big improvement over where we were several years earlier, it still left 135,000 kids across the state experiencing poverty and all of the stresses that can come along with that. And when we talk about poverty, it's really important to talk about specifically what we mean by that. Poverty is defined and measured by something called the federal poverty level. It's put together by the federal government. So we here in Colorado have no control or say over what this cutoff is. And the federal government is pretty out of touch when it comes to what it takes to raise a family nowadays, because their cutoff for poverty in 2019 was only about $26,000 a year for a family of 4. Now, all of us who are working and paying bills, paying the mortgage or the rent or for childcare know that $26,000 is not adequate to be able to meet children's basic needs. So when we talk about those 11% of Colorado kids or 135,000 Colorado kids who are living in poverty, that's definitely, especially in the Denver metro area, an underestimate of the number of kids that are struggling to get by because we're using such a low measure of what it means to be poor. So we could have families in Adams County earning $28,000 a year for a family of 4, still definitely struggling to be able to pay for all those basic needs, but not captured in these numbers here. So just sort of an important caveat there. And just bear with me, sometimes with Zoom, my slides freeze up here for a moment. There we go. So we can take a look at a similar trend for Adams County. Adams County's child poverty rate is the blue line that you see here. And even though the numbers are different, the trend is pretty similar to what we saw at the state level. Adams County, like most communities across the state, saw a really significant increase in child poverty in those Great Recession years and immediately afterwards, with almost 1 in 4 kids in the county living in poverty as of 2011. And then since then, you can see that it fell almost by half in sort of the decade afterwards. And the most recent estimates show that about 12% of Adams County kids were living below that income threshold. But if we are just looking at countywide data, it can sort of mask what's going on within a community that's as diverse as Adams County, because we know that you all have very urban communities, very rural communities. Communities look very different depending on where you are within the county. And so this is a map that shows the child poverty rate by census tract, so a much smaller geographic area than the county as a whole. And apologies to the far eastern part of the county. You see that you're cut off there. It's only because that whole part of the county was that same light purple color there. So just didn't want you to think that we cut you out intentionally. But what you can see here is that even though the child poverty rate for Adams County as a whole is right on par with that statewide average, it's at 12%. More than a third of kids in some communities within the county are living in poverty. That's those really dark purple areas that you see there in places like Aurora, Commerce City, North Glen. So it's important to note that even though we've seen positive trends with child poverty in Adams County, that there are some communities, some pockets within the county where child poverty rates remain extremely high. We also, just like we see child poverty vary a lot by specific community, we see a lot of differences in child poverty rates by race and ethnicity as well. This is a graph for Adams County, but this issue is definitely not unique to Adams County. We see similar trends across Colorado and across the United States because unfortunately, there are still a lot more barriers to economic opportunity for families of color than there are for white families. And so you'll see very different poverty rates for different races and ethnicities when you drill down and look at the data that way. And you can see that for Adams County, poverty rates vary from 7% of all white children between 2015 and 2019 up to almost 1 in 5 or almost 1 in 4 for Adams County's Hispanic or Latino or Black or African American children. So a lot of work to do to make sure that communities across the state as a whole, is doing more to remove barriers for families of color because we can see just how stark the differences are here. So everything that we've talked about until now was sort of leading up to the pandemic, but of course, a lot changed when COVID hit our state in March of 2020, and stay-at-home issues were ordered to try to keep people safe. And so we can take a look at whatever data we have out there on the pandemic time period to look at what was going on for families economically since that happened. And when we look at a lot of different indicators, we see really pervasive economic struggles for families since March of 2020. And the unemployment rate here is just one example. So you can see that back in early 2020, in January and February, Colorado was experiencing almost record lows in its unemployment rate. And then, of course, mid-March, COVID starts really taking hold, things are shutting down, and you see that unemployment rate for our state skyrocket up to 12%. So more than 1 in 10 Coloradans out of work during that spring and summer of 2020, really widespread struggles. You can see that after the summer was over and things sort of started opening back up a little bit, we did see the unemployment rate go back down, but even as of December 2020, we were still more than twice as high as a state as we were back in January and February. So a lot of families struggling over a long period of time. And I think it's important to note here too that even though we see those unemployment rates at their really high levels just for a few months, there's a lot of research out there to show that even when kids experience poverty for just a short spell of time, it can have really long-term impacts on their development if they aren't provided with that support and those resources that they need to help mitigate the impact of what they just went through. So you'll hear me say this a lot throughout the presentation today, but it's just one example of how even once we see these indicators start going back down to a normal level, things are getting better, things are feeling more normal. It's important that we don't just say, okay, we're back to normal. We really have to maintain a focus over the next several years on making sure that we're continuing to address the impacts of the pandemic on our kids, because even though some of these struggles that they face might be temporary, the impacts will not be if we're not providing them and their families with support in the years ahead. So that was Colorado. We can also take a look at Adams County here and see that the pattern looks pretty similar with that really big jump in the unemployment rate in April of 2020, almost 13% of people in Adams County unemployed. And then even when we saw that improvement, the unemployment rate still remained really high as of December of 2020. So similar trend to the state with a lot of families having trouble getting by. We can also look at families, specifically households in Colorado with children, and some different indicators of economic hardship that come from the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. So this is one of those that has data for the state only, and it shows that among all Colorado households with kids, about half have reported a loss of household income since the pandemic began. Half, that's a huge number. About a third have reported difficulty paying for their usual household expenses since the pandemic started, things like food or medical care. And then finally, as many as 1 in 5 have reported that they had little to no confidence in their ability to pay their next rent or mortgage payment. And this one is especially troubling because we know that affordable housing in Colorado was not easy to find even before the pandemic hit. And then when you're layering this job loss and income loss and economic struggle from the pandemic on top of those existing housing challenges, we know that we have tons and tons of families that are in a really tough spot when it comes to keeping a safe and stable roof over their children's heads. And having a safe, consistent place to call home is always important for kids. But think about 2020 when most of us were spending almost all of our time at home. Home was the setting for school, for work for many people. People had their kids home from childcare. So during that time period, housing and stable housing was even more important than ever. And unfortunately, we just see so many families reporting that they were struggling to be able to make that next housing payment. So we talked a little bit about the differences in child poverty that existed before the pandemic hit. We can also look at differences in these economic struggles during the pandemic by race and ethnicity. And when we do that, we see that again, our families of color in Colorado were disproportionately harmed by the pandemic's economic fallout, and that the COVID crisis really worsened a lot of these long-standing racial inequities that we have in our state. And we can see that across all the indicators that we just talked about here for the races where we have data available. For example, if we look at Colorado families with kids who lost employment income since the pandemic started, rates are certainly high across the board, but you can see they're especially high for our Hispanic or Latino families in Colorado, where almost 2/3 reported losing employment income. Similar differences when we look at difficulty paying for usual expenses in the past week. That problem affected about 1/4 of all white families with kids in the state, compared to almost half of all families of 2 or more races or Hispanic or Latino families in Colorado. And then similar gaps here for little or no confidence and ability to pay the next housing payment on time. That particular issue affected almost 1/3 of our Hispanic or Latino families. So moving out of the pandemic, hopefully, fingers crossed, it will be important to think about how do we support all families with kids, of course, but we really need to be thinking about how can we make sure that families of color especially have the resources that they need and remove barriers for them, given that they were hit harder by the economic impacts and the health impacts of COVID over the last couple of years. So I'll pause there. I see we've had a couple things in the chat that have come up. Let's see. Impact of the child tax credit, both while in place and now after it's lapsed. I would think that while in place, we saw a drastic reduction in Adams County child poverty. Great question. So I don't have Adams County specific data, but there have been a lot of national studies done that have looked at the impact of the child tax credit. And you are exactly right that there was a significant drop in poverty among kids while those monthly payments were going out. And for anyone who might not be familiar with that child tax credit expansion, it was something that was put in place by the federal government during the pandemic, where most families with kids under a certain income level were receiving monthly payments somewhere around $250 to $300, depending on their child's age, from July through December of 2021. And these payments were used by families for basic needs a lot of the time. So things like childcare or diapers or transportation. There's a lot of research to show that families really were relying on this extra funding to be able to meet the needs that their children were having during the pandemic, especially. However, Congress did not renew those sort of payments that were going out on a monthly basis, and so that families are no longer receiving them as of January. And so when you look at the national data, you do see a big drop in child poverty during the months when those payments were going out. And then not surprisingly, a big uptick in child poverty once those payments stopped. So it just goes to show how important those policy changes can be in the lives of kids and families. One reason why we can't really say what's going on in Adams County specifically with that is because the way poverty is calculated officially, it doesn't include things like the child tax credit in a family's income. And so we wouldn't necessarily see that big reduction showing up in the official poverty numbers. But these other studies that are sort of able to consider that extra income from the child tax credit have found that it had a big impact on families' economic well-being. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that was really important and something that's important to sort of keep advocating with our federal elected officials on, because they have the power to change that. Do we have an understanding of the capture rate of Colorado eligible families and how many will engage the remaining tax benefit when filing taxes this year? I don't have that information off the top of my head. I do think that the Census Bureau Household Pulse Survey was asking families if they received a child tax credit payment in the last several months. So that wouldn't necessarily get at the capture rate because it wouldn't tell you who was eligible compared to who received it, but I'm happy to take a look at that, a look for that data and try to see what I can find for you, Peter. If you wanna, my email address will be at the end of the presentation and you can feel free to reach out and I will try to help you find what you need. Great. Any other questions or thoughts that people have, things that you want to share that you're seeing happening in Adams County? Most recent census strand that would show Adams County neighborhood adult educational attainment. There probably is. It would probably be by census tract, how we showed the child poverty rates, and there might be some large margins of error with that data if we're looking at the neighborhood or census tract level. But the Census Bureau does collect data on adult educational attainment. They're just about to release a big data release in the next couple of weeks or so. So again, if you want to send me an email with I'll just go ahead and put my email in the chat. Actually, it'll be at the end of the presentation, but happy to look for those data for you as well. Other thoughts or questions? Do the numbers also reflect undocumented families? Most of them should. So if we're talking about Census Bureau data, census surveys get sent out. They have a list of addresses that they send them out to. It doesn't consider whether a family is undocumented or documented. So undocumented families are certainly invited to participate in these surveys. However, there's a lot of research to show that participation among undocumented families tends to be lower among families with documentation, usually because of fear of filling out a government survey. So it's likely that these numbers do include undocumented families, but it's likely that they're underrepresented just because of the lower participation rates. All right, excellent questions. I'm going to move through to child health, but if other questions come up on family economic security or anything else, please feel free to keep putting those in the chat and we will get to them after the health section. When we were looking at child health and kids count this year, one thing that we knew we really wanted to have a strong focus on was mental health, because we've been hearing since the pandemic began about just how widespread mental health struggles are for really everyone, whether you're a parent, a caregiver, a child care provider, a teacher, a child. All of us have seen our lives completely disrupted over the last couple of years. And those disruptions and the social isolation, especially early in the pandemic, can really have a huge impact on the mental health of kids and their families. So we wanted to be sure to talk about that this year. When we put the report out, data on kids' mental health specifically was still pretty limited, but there is some good data out there on the mental health of adults who are taking care of children. So we can take a look at some of that to start off with. If my slides will cooperate, there we go. So if we look at adults in Colorado who live in households with children, since the pandemic started, we see that symptoms of depression and anxiety have been really widespread. So looking first at anxiety, this reflects the time period between May of 2020 and March of 2021, so sort of that first year of the pandemic. And you can see that those numbers are extremely high. So as of the winter of 2020, 41% of all adults living in households with kids reported symptoms of anxiety for more than half the days or nearly every day in the past week. Rates of depression were a little bit lower, but still a quarter of all adults reporting these symptoms during that winter of 2020 period. And again, these data reflect adults' experiences and not kids' experiences, but even before the pandemic, there was a ton of research to show that kids' mental health is really closely linked to the mental health of their caregivers. And so we know that if we had such high numbers of caregivers with children struggling with their mental health, that numbers for kids are probably escalating as well. And since we put the report out, there's been some new data coming out from the CDC or from the American Academy of Pediatrics showing that things like emergency room visits for mental health struggles among kids as young as like 6 or 7 have been escalating throughout the course of the pandemic. And so we know that we really probably, this is a, not probably, it definitely is a very urgent need that we need to address across the state, because the stress that everyone has been through over the past couple of years has really taken a toll on our families and on our kids. And in many communities, the support just, the scale is not large enough to support all of the kids that likely need care. And these mental health struggles are troubling because, again, talking about the value of pre-pandemic data, Colorado was already seeing really historically high rates of teen suicide across the state, even before the pandemic was a factor. We saw our state's teen suicide rate jump up significantly in 2015. And I think I remember seeing this number and thinking maybe this will just be one bad year, maybe things will go back down to where they've historically been. But you can see that the teen suicide rate never really went back down. It's really remained at these high levels, historically high levels over the past several years. And even though we did not see a huge spike in teen suicides in 2020, as we might have expected to see based on everything that was happening, it did increase a little bit, and it did remain at those really high levels. And so as of 2020, we had 83 teenagers across the state who lost their lives to suicide, which is more than double where we were back in 2010. So again, just shows a really urgent need to be addressing our kids' mental health, kids of all ages, because it is such a pressing issue. And if we look specifically at Adams County in 2020 saw 11 suicides among teens ages 15 to 19, which puts the Adams County rate higher than the statewide average at 28.5 suicides per 100,000 teens in that age group. Adams County also saw 4 suicides among 10 to 14-year-olds. So again, this is an issue that's not just affecting older kids, it's affecting more and more younger children as well. Another group that we think might have been at heightened risk for mental health struggles during the pandemic is pregnant or postpartum Coloradans, for a couple of reasons. We know that mental health struggles among pregnant or postpartum people were already really common even before the pandemic hit. So these are some pre-pandemic data that you see here that showed that 12% of postpartum people in Colorado reported experiencing depressive symptoms. Almost 1 in 3 had elevated symptoms of anxiety by the time they were 12 months postpartum. And then even though those issues were really common, fewer than 2/3 of people who reported needing or wanting mental health care or counseling were actually able to access that care. And again, that's before the pandemic hit and before we saw a lot of new barriers to folks getting care. So we know that having a new baby is a challenging transition at any time, but when you layer those pandemic factors on top, the social isolation for new parents, especially at the beginning of the pandemic before vaccines were available, oftentimes not being able to go to your postpartum appointment in person back when doctors were doing more telehealth at the beginning of the pandemic, not being able to get in-person lactation support in many instances, not being able to have your community of people rally around you and come over and hold your baby while you took a nap. All of those things are going to just exacerbate a lot of the challenges that existed for new parents even before COVID. So we can take a look here at sort of since the pandemic started, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment put out a special COVID-19 survey called the Healthy Moms COVID-19 survey that looked at parents that had given birth over the course of the first year of the pandemic. And we see that among that group, half of all Coloradans who gave birth during the first year of the pandemic reported that their mental health had gotten worse. 40% reported that they needed or wanted mental health care since they had had their baby during the pandemic. But of those who needed or wanted it, only half reported being able to actually get that care. And remember, that's compared to 2/3 of people being able to get care before COVID hit. So we know that the pandemic introduced a lot of new barriers for new parents who wanted to get the mental health care that they needed. And then we can also take a look at some of the barriers to care for those who wanted it but did not get it. Number one was the cost of care, which makes sense when you consider the widespread economic struggles that were happening during the first year of the COVID crisis. And then not having someone to watch their children was a big barrier for a lot of folks as well, which just speaks to the importance of childcare. So we think these numbers are really important, not just for the parents, but also for the kids, because I know I'm preaching to the choir with this group, but we know how important those early years are in terms of brain development for everything that comes afterwards. And we want parents to feel healthy and supported and feel like they have the resources that they need to be able to take good care of their children. So this is a group that, again, we probably need to prioritize in terms of getting them support throughout the next few years. So we'll shift gears a little bit here and talk about the pre-pandemic time period. But again, this is another really important trend. Apologies if you can hear my dog barking in the background. They always have to make themselves known while I'm on a Zoom call. He's really pumped up about uninsured rates, apparently. But this uninsured rates were a good news story for Colorado for many years. We saw our uninsured rates for kids falling really steadily between 2008 and 2016. You can see that the uninsured rate fell from 14% of all kids in the state down to 4% of all kids in the state. Unfortunately, since 2016, we saw that progress stagnate and then actually start to reverse itself. And so we were going into the pandemic, the worst public health crisis that our country has seen in a century, with 70,000 kids across the state lacking access to insurance coverage. And again, insurance coverage is important at any time, but especially during a public health crisis. And so this is one of those areas where we want to make sure that we don't lose all of the hard-won progress that Colorado has made on getting kids connected to coverage over the last several years or so. And then if we look at Adams County specifically, we see a similar pattern with progress on the uninsured rate happening really, really quickly between 2008 and 2016. And then that progress sort of grounding to a halt in the last couple of years. Any questions on child health? And I see there have been some things popping up in the chat, so I'll just take a look there and see if there's anything that's come up. Such high numbers. We knew this was happening in households before and exacerbated during the pandemic. A tremendous amount of stress for everybody. Yes. Curious if there are data or theories as to why. Assuming that you are referring to the mental health data, but I'm not sure. I think with the mental health data, just the stress that you pointed to about, I mean, we've really been putting unprecedented demands on parents and caregivers, especially over the last few years, with people trying to work and take care of kids who might be out of childcare or might be at home for remote schooling. There's been a lot of disruption where people don't have outlets to social activities or to just that community support that people were maybe able to access before the pandemic. And so I think there's probably a lot of reasons why we're seeing escalations in a lot of these mental health indicators.
And Sarah, sorry.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Really quick, I just wanted to clarify that one as well. I know that I could be totally mistaken. You're the data expert. I am not. But Colorado has had pretty high suicide rates for teenagers even before the pandemic. And I was really, not that you have to have this either, but referring to why this is high. I'm just wondering if, and we're littles, but littles get big. So just didn't know why, or even if we have information about why Colorado, like they've been really high for years, our numbers.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that question. And you're exactly right. Even before the pandemic, we were sort of an outlier when it came to our teen suicide rates. And I don't think anybody has a really solid answer to that question. There was a study that was done, I think it was sponsored by the Attorney General's office a couple of years ago, where researchers went into different Colorado communities and talked to teens about, like, why do you think suicide rates are so high in your communities? And a lot of the factors that they brought up were particularly in some rural communities, just a lack of belonging for a lot of students. So LGBTQ students brought that up, especially just feeling ostracized or a lack of support, a lack of sort of healthy social activities was another thing that came up in different communities. And another thing that came up was exposure to adult suicide. So when people were seeing adult suicides happening in their communities, teens felt like that was influencing teen suicides as well. So when I send Lisa the presentation, I'll send that report as well, because it has so much good information from teens themselves about what they see as driving that trend, because it's a great question. We've always sort of been worse than average, and people are understandably really hungry to understand why that is. So thank you for raising that.
I was just gonna interject too. That is a question that comes up when I'm doing the statewide travel that I do with the IAK network, because you're right, we've been doing these reports. At least I have been through, like 7 years of this data, observing it not really make significant strides. Like some years are better than others. And I do know that like most of the folks in the field talk a lot about, like they can definitely, like any of you all could definitely name factors that contribute. And I do think that it's not that it's contagious, but like Sarah mentioned, there are like sort of within communities, like a spurt of attempts, or, not that people are like, I'd like to do that, but it just like, oh, Rachel, your comment exactly. So the effect of like talking about it and hearing about it can make you realize, actually, I also feel however that is. And then another thing that has come up across the state that I have just heard anecdotally. So again, I don't have a study to point to, but I've heard it so much that it bears repeating, that I think a lot of folks in different communities feel that like, whether or not you're actually a native to the West or the like frontier mindset, as far as this like very individual, it's the lack of connection that comes from this like, pull yourself up, and like, there's this like Western frontier, like we're on our own individual, like ruggedness that sometimes does come out in a lack of being able to express like, actually, this might not be socially acceptable, but this is how I'm feeling. And then you grow up with that and it's hard to figure out a new path. So that has come up in most communities. So like Western Slope, the Eastern Plains, the San Luis Valley, those are the things that has come up every time. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but let us know if there's down the road we can help with that. We'd love to talk more.
A side comment, I don't know if it's helpful or not, but just yesterday I was having a conversation with another fellow of mine that felt really anxious. And before that, I had already been thinking that I know a lot of people now that weren't depressed before, weren't anxious before, adults that now feel like my community, it's everywhere I see it, it's there. Like there's no way that I can talk to somebody and they're not depressed or they're not anxious. And like they said before, it's not contagious, but it feels like it right now. It feels like we are all contagious of this depression, because when I hear about it, I get sad as well and I get anxious. And then I try to support somebody, but wow, it's like kids, adults, what my conclusion was over that conversation was like, first it was the kids because they were home, they were stuck and we were taking care of them. But now it's like the pandemic, the struggles, the everyday life on top of the war and all the other stuff. It's just coming to a reality to all us adults that life is not the same as it was for our parents. And it's a big struggle. With the suicide too, teens, they see that as an option because they talk about it so much. Like they see it on TV shows everywhere now. And it's not that we need to hide it. We need to talk more about it, but we need to talk to them first before the other people get to them. Sorry. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And you're exactly right. With 2 years into a pandemic and 2 years into all of the stress, it does feel like it's affecting everybody. Whereas before, if you were having a hard time, chances are there was someone in your life, hopefully, that you could go to and talk to about that, who could hold that for you and help you. But right now, when everybody is so burned out and everybody is so depressed and anxious, it feels much, much harder to do that. So I don't have the solution, but I thank you for bringing that up. And I think it just speaks to the importance of making sure that we don't let our policymakers forget how important mental health care is going to be for all of us, and for kids and for parents, especially over the next several years. So thank you for those comments. I see another question here about why children have not been covered by health insurance. I'll just answer this one real quick before we move on to our last sort of data here. There's data to show that the increase in the uninsured rate has largely been among kids in lower income families who actually do qualify for health coverage through Medicaid or through the Child Health Plan Plus, or CHIP as it's often called. And so because that coverage is available, it sort of speaks to a different solution, which is making sure that we are informing families of these programs, that they exist, that they're safe for them to use. I think if you think about what was happening between 2016 and 2020, there was a lot of rhetoric against immigrant communities in particular that made a lot of folks feel unsafe signing up for a government program and providing their children's information. And so that certainly could be playing a role. But we do think it's interesting that that uninsured increase tends to be happening among kids who do qualify for coverage. So it's just a matter of thinking through what's keeping people from being able to take advantage of that coverage. And I am going to move on to early childhood. I'll try to move somewhat quickly so that we have some time for questions at the end, because I know we're scheduled to wrap up at 10. And I know many of you are already very familiar with the early childhood needs in your community, but I wanted to talk for just a minute about access to childcare in Colorado. This is something that we know was already, anybody with a young child knows, was already a huge issue before the pandemic hit. We simply did not have enough care in many communities in any form to serve all of the families who likely needed care. And we can take a look at what that shortage looked like across the state of Colorado before COVID in 2019. Before COVID, we had about 246,000 kids across the state who were living, or young kids across the state who were living with all parents in the labor force. So these are kids who probably needed some form of care at some point during the day. Unfortunately, if we looked at the licensed capacity in our childcare centers, family childcare homes, and preschools, we only had enough slots to serve about 2/3 of those kids, which left about 1/3 of families with young kids across the state in a huge bind because they needed to work, they were in the labor force, and they didn't necessarily have a stable place for their children to go during the day while they did that work. Now, unfortunately, we can't include family, friend, and neighbor providers in these numbers because there's just not great data on the number of those folks out there. But we know that even if we were able to include FFN providers, still, just from talking to people, that's still not enough care for all of the families with young kids who likely needed it. Now, what did this look like in Adams County before the pandemic hit? Adams County had about 26,000 young kids with all parents in the labor force, and only about 43% were able to access a licensed slot. So, and Adams County is not alone in this. This is an issue, especially across a lot of the Denver metro area, where there's just not enough capacity out there to be able to meet the needs of all families who would like to have care. So it just speaks to the importance of groups like the Early Childhood Partnership of Adams County, who are doing really great work to try to increase access to high quality care. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and I know I probably don't need to drill this point home with this crowd, but we know the pandemic was really hard and continues to be really hard on childcare providers. Our friends at Early Milestones Colorado found that almost 1 in 10 providers across the state closed during the early part of the pandemic, and total enrollment dropped by half. And then if we look at families, we see that about 2/3 of Colorado families reported having to alter their childcare arrangements due to the pandemic. And 1/3, even in the summer of 2020, once stay-at-home orders had lifted and some centers and family childcare homes had opened their doors again, about 1/3 reported not having the care that they needed when surveyed. So we know that that capacity issue has probably gotten even tougher in a lot of places in light of what's gone on in the last couple of years. Also wanted to talk briefly about referrals to early intervention. So if you're not familiar with early intervention, it's a wonderful program that serves kids ages birth to 3 who have a delay in their development. It could be a speech delay, it could be a cognitive delay or a motor delay. But if they qualify for services, it provides them with free services to help address those delays while they're very young, because the earlier you intervene, obviously you all know this as an early childhood group, the better chances of success you have. So early and timely is what's important here. This is a graph that shows early intervention referrals in 2019. That's the gray line that you see there. And then 2020, that's the teal line. And you can see that between January and March of 2020, referrals were tracking right along where they were the year before. Then the pandemic hits in March of 2020, and those referrals plummet off of a cliff, going from more than 400 a week across the state to only 155 the week of March 15th, which is sort of right after everything started shutting down. They did recover somewhat over the next several months, but you can see that 2020 referrals remained below their 2019 levels for almost the whole rest of the year. And this is really discouraging because, again, we know early matters. And so the fact that we had a lot of kids who likely had a delay and who were likely missing out on services for that whole year is really troubling. And again, another example of why we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can now to support families with young kids and make sure that they don't miss out on any additional time and any additional support that they might need. And then we can also look at what these referrals look like in Adams County, a similar trend here where referrals were at sort of normal levels between January and March, and then fell really significantly once the pandemic hit. And then finally, we see a similar trend with preschool programs in Colorado and in Adams County as well. We don't have data on all preschool programs, only school district preschool programs, because that's what we're able to get. But school district preschool data show that enrollment was down almost 25% in the fall of 2020 in comparison to the fall of 2019, with even larger declines for some groups of students. Now, some of these students who were enrolling may have been able to have really great enriching experiences at home during that preschool year, but we know that many kids probably did not, given all of the stress that was happening. And so presumably these kids are going to be entering kindergarten at some point, and we know that many of them are going to be entering without the skills that they need to be successful, and skills that they might have been able to learn during that preschool year had they been able to enroll. So just again, a need for a lot of support for our kids as they move through the K-12 education system, given some of the opportunities that they missed out on during the pandemic. And we can take a look at Adams County here. Adams County saw really similar patterns with, again, a 25% drop in enrollment in just 1 year. So I have a little bit of K-12 education data. I think I'm going to skip over this for now because it's just a little, and we will send out this presentation to Lisa so you can take a look at the presentation. Mostly, I want to make sure that we have some time for questions and for wrap up here, because I know we are scheduled to end at 10. So let's see what's come up in the chat. Let's see. Yes, I have seen some comments about staffing childcare. That's absolutely something that we are hearing in communities across the state, just how difficult it is to attract people right now. We know that was an issue even before the pandemic hit. And now with there being a workforce shortage across a lot of different industries, we're just hearing more and more how difficult it is to keep teachers, hire teachers, that sort of thing. So thank you for bringing that up. And agree with Lisa, this data does feel really heavy. It can be really hard and overwhelming to talk about all of the different ways that everybody has been affected over the last couple of years. But thankfully, we have folks like you, 60 people first thing on a Monday morning, signing on to talk about kids and families. And there's such strength in this group, I know, and just appreciate the amazing work that you all are doing and will continue to do to make sure that the pandemic is hopefully more of just a bump in the road for Adams County kids and not something that derails their development for a long time to come. So I just had a couple of resources at the end here that I'll highlight if my slides will cooperate. You can, when we send this presentation out, we'll link you to our policy priorities so that you can see what we're working on at the legislature. And if you have an interest in getting involved, we would definitely be happy to connect you to the right person who's leading that policy. Also just have some informational resources like our podcast and our newsletter. And then also you'll have a link to the report in the Kids Count Data Center where you can find a lot, excuse me, a lot more information. But just want to say thank you all so much for being here and for all of the great work that you're doing. As our participant mentioned, we're all feeling very depressed and anxious and worn out and tired from the last couple of years. And so the fact that you all are continuing to show up for kids in your communities is just really amazing. And we really appreciate your partnership.
1 minute left. Thank you, everyone. This is great. As Sarah mentioned, I will get this out to you. Kids Count comes out every year. We always want to share that with you. It is on their website as well. Colorado Children's Campaign's website. You can pull up all the reports for the past 10, 15 years and track how things have changed over time. And we use the Kids Count reports in everything we do. So thank you to Colorado Children's Campaign for all your hard work. You guys are amazing. For everyone on this phone to know, we are on calls with these folks weekly about legislative and policy changes, as we know that's what it really takes to shift how things happen. So thanks to you, Colorado Children's Campaign. Thanks to our wonderful partners. Happy Monday. Stay warm, and please, please, please reach out. If you have, after you're pondering this, if something comes to your mind, reach out. We want to act on this data. We want to work together. So thanks, everyone, and have a happy Monday.